And when you go out to life's struggles and adventures, you will raise a banner. You will raise a banner who follow you. For the deaf who follow you.
Helen Keller, both blind and deaf, accomplished more in her exceptional life than many people without disabilities could even dream of. Her indomitable spirit, love of life, and her fellow human have inspired millions over the last century. Helen Keller was a pioneer, overcoming incredible personal obstacles and prejudice to prove to the world the limitless capacity of a person with disabilities. Helen broke numerous barriers for those with disabilities and other marginalized members of society by courageously educating the world as to their capabilities and needs, and erected new barriers to protect against further injustice. At only 19 months old, Helen Keller was rendered blind and deaf by an unknown illness, and spent her early years as a frustrated, lost, and temper-prone child. At age 6, Helen's parents, in desperation, hired Anne Sullivan as a teacher for Helen.
Anne Sullivan taught her that there is a word for every object. And she kept on going over and over some objects until she hit on water in the water pump, and that was the breakthrough for Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan.
Keller later wrote in her autobiography, "As a cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could in time be swept away." Thus began a lifetime partnership.
There's no more remarkable example of a talented teacher and a brilliant student as there is with Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller.
With Anne Sullivan's constant guidance, Helen learned to read and write and many different codes for the blind, and became fluent in 5 languages. Defying society's expectations, Helen, a true pioneer, became the first deafblind person to graduate from college. In fact, she received a bachelor's degree and graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College, the women's counterpart of the then men-only Harvard University, paving a path for others to follow. In the early 1900s, people with disabilities were routinely considered lower class.
You weren't expected to be able to function in the world on your own. People with disabilities would be considered sort of, folks who should remain in the house and not be presented to company.
The awareness of the needs of those with disabilities was also in its infancy. For example, when Helen was in college, she was fluent in the many different systems of raised or embossed code that existed for visually impaired people. Helen Keller played a pivotal and decisive role in the selection of Braille as a system of writing for the visually impaired, opening new pathways to education. Choosing Braille also broke barriers to independence by allowing the eventual development of assistive devices for the blind as the technology was developed.
If there had been many standards of Braille, it would have been very hard for us to develop a product that could be used not only by people in the United States, but by people who are around the world.
Helen Keller was astutely intelligent and used her extraordinary reading and writing skills to advocate for those who were disadvantaged, sharing articulate and eloquent communications with millions across the world. A prolific writer, she penned over 12 books and 475 essays and speeches on countless humanitarian and political topics, continually cracking the impediments of prejudice against those with disabilities. During her lifetime, Helen met 12 American presidents, corresponding with many of them on her impassioned campaigns. One of Keller's humanitarian causes was preventing infant blindness by utilizing silver nitrate eye drops in newborns' eyes. By publishing articles in the Ladies' Home Journal, Keller reached nearly 1 million women, creating positive and ongoing barriers to infant blindness by spreading the word and ultimately helping the treatment gain acceptance in the medical field. Helen Keller International was co-founded by Helen in 1915, which began its blind relief efforts for European soldiers. She later visited over 70 Army hospitals nationwide and helped to put in place legislation for rehabilitation services for wounded veterans. Beginning in 1924, the American Foundation for the Blind employed Helen as their most famous ambassador for over 44 years. Both organizations gave Keller opportunities to campaign for the rights and needs of people with disabilities around the globe. Visiting an astounding 39 countries and meeting and befriending numerous foreign leaders, Helen was an exemplary role model, transforming worldviews on disability. One of her many accomplishments during that time included using her formidable influence to endorse the Pratt-Smoot Act.
Helen Keller was very instrumental in getting the law passed. She talked to the Congress, the senators, and then she went to Washington and talked to federal administrators.
This allowed the creation of a national library service for the blind and physically handicapped, facilitating the standardized printing and availability of Braille and talking books in libraries across the country. The library service dismantled constraints to education and independence, as those with visual and auditory impairments gained access to books that they could read by themselves. Some of Keller's more controversial pursuits include her commitments to socialism, labor and workers' rights, pacifism, anti-racism, equality, and women's rights and suffrage. After joining the Socialist Party in 1909, Keller visited many factories and was horrified at the awful working conditions. She decried the accidents and illnesses from unsafe job sites were a primary cause of disability in the U.S. and were the results of owners' greed and capitalism. Rising above her Southern upbringing, Helen also challenged prejudice constraints by being an early representative of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, writing, "Ashamed in my very soul I behold in my own beloved Southland the tears of those who are oppressed." During a time when the idea of free speech was unheard of, Helen was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920, ultimately creating a positive barrier to the crime of human rights violations. While Helen was lauded as a visionary when campaigning for disability rights, she was publicly denounced and shunned by many popular newspapers when championing her unpopular convictions. However, she continued to advocate for what she knew to be true. Helen Keller was a woman who thought for herself. Her courage, empathy, and foresight to address the barriers of greed, prejudice, and ignorance sowed the seeds of change for future generations. 4 years before her death, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded Keller the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civil honor for peacetime service. In 1960, Keller suffered a stroke and retired to her home in Westport, Connecticut. There she resided peacefully until her death on June 1, 1968. Helen Keller's struggles and triumphs still continue today. Nearly 100 years after Helen Keller shocked the nation by becoming the first deafblind college graduate, Haben Girma became the first deafblind person to graduate from Harvard Law School.
Many people reduce the story of Helen Keller to one thing: a woman who succeeded despite her disabilities. Disability never holds anyone back. Disability is never the barrier. The barrier is society and expectations.
Although there is arguably more work to be done in eliminating the inequity that faces people with disabilities, the fruits of Helen's impassioned activism indeed influenced the course of history. During Helen's lifetime, rehabilitation services were made available, schools for those with disabilities were built, and state commissions for the blind were created, offering new job opportunities for those with disabilities.
And that was a very important message that she wanted to give, that people with disabilities, they can live and work in the mainstream of society and make contributions.
Helen changed the perception of disability, allowing society to view disabled people with a new respect. The many organizations and laws that Helen helped create and foster continue to have far-reaching impact, thanks to the numerous barriers Helen broke through her lifetime of advocacy for rights, accessibility, and inclusion. Since Helen Keller's days of steadfast activism for equality in an unequal world, continued strides have been made in the areas of civil rights, anti-racism, and women's rights. Keller lived her life in the public eye as a server of mankind and a champion of the oppressed, unapologetically fighting for what she believed in, unheard of for a woman and especially a person with disabilities in the 19th century. When Helen Keller tore down the barriers that handicapped humanity, she caused a waterfall of positive change in the world that is still flowing today.
And spell out letters at a time the headlines. I mean, it would take her 2 minutes to go over maybe 2 or 3 sentences of a headline in the newspaper. After getting such little information into that brain, coming back and giving so much back to society, it's just incredible.